So as many of you already know, I recently was in Dallas, Texas, yet again, the fourth time in the last 6 months for DebateCon. Now, this was the Modern Day Debates channel's first live event, and I think, all things considered, they did a good job getting it off the ground. Were there some things that they could have changed or done better or whatever, doesn't really matter. Throw your criticisms at them, but in reality, it's cool to see somebody doing something, and I'm glad that I was invited to this first ever event that the Modern Day Debates people actually did. And they really hustled to make it work. Special thanks to James, the guy that you see on camera a lot, Bob, who's behind the camera, Amy and Rachel, who worked hard to get this event off the ground, and of course, one of my subscribers who insisted on taking me out to dinner, Hunter, and of course, his associate, not doxing anybody, but they together, Daniel. I really appreciate you guys a lot for coming out to the event. It was awesome. I really appreciated it. But I do want to go over some of the things related to some of the debates and conversations that I had. I had 3. I'm going to probably focus solely on the Ben Burgis one where I was teamed with NuanceBro versus also Xanderhal, because this was the one that I was actually booked for. This was the one that I was looking forward to the most. And this is the one that needs more context so that you guys can understand what was actually being said. Now, first and foremost, I do have one criticism that I thought of after the fact. So then again, I can't really get on James or anybody for not thinking of it after the fact, but I couldn't really see Ben Burgis from where I was sitting at the table, and I realized if they would have put it in a V pattern, they could have got everybody on camera and we would have been able to see people rather than the pattern that they had. Something to note for the future that I didn't even think of at the time, and had I thought of that, it would have actually been more interesting because it was difficult to see Ben, so I couldn't see his reactions, and I had times trouble hearing what he had to say, but mostly I got everything down from his perspective. Something is just not adding up. Stocks are at all-time highs, but the government just printed $5 trillion, and the Biden administration is intent on telling you that inflation, not to be worried about, it's just transitory, even though it's up 6.8%, and your wages haven't gone up with it, but gas and electricity also on the rise. Look, if things are as bad as the indicators would lead me to believe, you might want to put some of your money in a precious metals IRA, and luckily for you, this month, if you call Noble Gold at 877-646-5347 or go to noblegoldinvestments.com and sign up, you will be gifted a free American Eagle 1/10 of an ounce gold coin with a qualifying plan. That's noblegoldinvestments.com, 877-646-5347. Now, like many of the other debates that I've had on criminal justice, this basically was a debate between two parties, and these two parties hold these two separate positions. Party number one, the one that I'm on, the one that NuanceBro is on, is that individuals are responsible for the crime that they commit. Party number two, if I'm giving them the steel man position, is that individuals may be responsible for their individual crimes that they commit. However, society as a whole contributes to that responsibility, thus obfuscating some of the blame. Therefore, we should address underlying problems in society in order to reduce the amount of bad individual choices. Theoretically, if they had better status, more material wealth, or more equality with other people, therefore they would commit less crime. Now, obviously, I reject this notion. I've rejected this notion multiple different times, whether people phrase it as an income inequality problem or a poverty problem, but that's really boring because you guys have seen me do that debate a million different times.
Do you think, obviously we see that there's a very disproportionate amount of crime and poverty for the black community here in America. Do you think the black community was impoverished first or committing crime first here in America?
They were poor, but they're northern blacks before the end of slavery, because we're going to talk about slavery at some point, did have higher homicide rates than northern whites even then. So and
also much higher poverty rates even then.
But I every time I get into a criminal justice debate, we always get bogged down on the crime poverty thing. So I would like to concede poverty as the cause of crime to you guys, just for the purpose of going forward, and ask you. And well, you're wrong, but I would like to concede this.
Clearly we're right, because you've not been able to provide any sort of alternate explanation, and you've said a bunch of things that are entirely consistent with the commonsensical, extremely well-established correlation between.
Well, first of all, correlation doesn't equal causation. But the reason
economic inequality, which is what we both said.
The reason
but that high rate, that poverty coinciding with relative wealth is something that does seem to lead to higher crime.
Well, first of all, demographics in poverty, in similar poverty, don't commit crimes at the same rates.
So there was a point during the course of the debate where I didn't really want to argue this. I wanted to just accept their premise. Like, let's buy into the fact that poverty or income inequality or whatever is the number one cause of crime. That is the underlying cause, even though, as I've talked about multiple different times, there are periods of time where we had less income inequality, where we had higher rates of crime. There are periods of time where we've had more poverty overall and more income inequality overall, and we've had higher rates of crime. All of those things have happened. A perfect example of this, and if you're one of those people who also likes to factor in racism, would be the 1950s versus the 1960s. People were poorer in the 50s. There was racism on the books in law in the 1950s, yet the black homicide rate, and blacks were poorer in the 50s, was lower than it was in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. So if you're blaming racism, if you're blaming poverty, then none of those actually appear to be factors. Now, if you're going with income inequality, it is true that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was more income inequality than there was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and crime was going up. However, during the course of the 2000s, we saw a crime drop, and that drop really started in the mid-90s, but we saw a crime drop while there was greater income inequality. So if income inequality is causing the crime, why does crime not appear to correlate with it? But I've made all of these points before. I've argued all of these arguments in previous debates and previous videos, and you guys have heard it all. And I like to bring new information, new tactics, and new patterns of thought, which are old patterns of thought that I'm restating for you as I read and study more about the subject of criminal justice. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is how this falls under what is called the underlying cause fallacy. The idea that the most efficient way to address a problem is to look for and identify the underlying cause and solve that underlying cause. So whether it's poverty or income inequality, the idea that that may lead to crime, therefore we must address income inequality or poverty, is a little bit ridiculous, because we know through practice, through bills, through legislation, through our own history, that having less tolerance from crime as a society, having stricter punishments, and actually pursuing the criminals is a more efficient, both cost efficient and faster way to deal with crime. While we're trying to arrest poverty or arrest income inequality, we're letting crime and murderers run free, run rampant, even though that's no solution, because we're looking for all these solutions to these underlying causes that are supposedly the problem. Think about Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty. By the way, it coincides with an increase in crime, not a decrease in crime. All of that welfareism was meant to address these underlying causes. It was meant to deal with the historic racism that put black people in poverty. It was meant to deal with poverty, and it was meant to deal with the inequality. During the course of that time, when all those things were supposedly, allegedly, theoretically getting better, we saw dramatic spikes in crime, which again, we're not trying to argue root cause.
I want to move on from that is because even if we accept the premise that poverty is the cause of crime, the idea that you address crime by addressing poverty is what's called the underlying cause fallacy. There's nothing to say that that is the most efficient way to deal with this dramatically different homicide rates. If you can incarcerate and deter people from committing these homicides on the policing level, then you don't have to like do all these abstract wealth redistributions. One day we're gonna arrest poverty and, you know, set all these Aladdins who are just committing.
But even if you're under the misperception that any of the things that Burgess or Xanderhal actually cause crime, you can see how spending trillions of dollars trying to deal with the underlying cause doesn't necessarily have those immediate effects. And when you're talking about crime, when you're talking about things like homicide, when you're talking about these important things, you're talking about people's lives that are being lost. So we owe it to our own citizens to address these things in the most efficient way humanly possible.
One that I was trying to make about like saying that poverty, it makes people so much more prone to crime, and therefore we should go easier on these poor criminals, doesn't make any sense. If you have a factor that makes you more prone to crime, then we should treat you harsher, not less harsh. Like if young men commit way more sexual assaults than women because young men are like their brains aren't fully developed, they have like sexual desires and all that, than 55-year-old women, that doesn't mean we should give young men who commit sexual assaults a slap on the wrist. We have to counterbalance factors that make it more likely for you to commit crime. This is why back in the day when people were in more desperate straits and they had to steal literally to survive, not this fake steal to survive where you're stealing flat screen TVs in order to feed your family, people would cut off your hand.
I don't know who you're responding to.
On top of that, there's another fallacy that is presented often by these people who tell you to arrest poverty, who tell you to arrest income inequality, who tell you to arrest systematic, structural racism systems. And that is the idea that if you have something that makes you more likely to be a criminal, then the answer is to go easier on you, not harder on you. This is completely backwards. Think about it like this. 20-year-olds overall are far more likely to commit sexual assault, 20-year-old males. And by the way, 20-year-olds overall tend to commit more crimes overall. Now, by the logic of you being more predisposed or you having stronger inclinations towards criminality, that we should treat you better or softer than we treat other members of the population, if a 55-year-old woman commits a sexual assault or any of the crimes that 20-year-olds are more prone to, we should punish that 55-year-old woman more severely than we should punish the 20-year-old because the 20-year-old is more prone to it. You see how this doesn't make sense? A 55-year-old woman is far less likely, whatever crime she commits, to reoffend on average than a 20-year-old, so we should probably have stronger deterrence for 20-year-olds than we should have for the 55-year-old woman. So even if you accept their underlying premise, even if you accept their cause, their solution is completely ass backwards. If poverty is such a driving force, if income inequality is such a driving force that it compels people that strongly to commit crimes, what we need is stronger deterrence, stronger disincentives, not weaker deterrence or weaker disincentives. So this was the point I was trying to make during the course of the conversation when I didn't want to argue about whether or not poverty was the root cause of crime, because even if it is, even if you accept that at face value, even if you accept any root cause at face value, that doesn't mean it's a mitigating factor. It could be an aggravating factor, meaning you need to go harder on people that are more prone to crime. And it doesn't mean that addressing that alleged root cause is the most efficient way to solve the problem. This completely went over the heads of the two people that I was debating. However, it's not anything that is outside the realm of common sense when you really think about it. On top of that, there were some other topics that, I'm not gonna lie, it was really funny to be up on the stage with NuanceBro when they were brought up, because he would just look over to me and smile every single time they hit on one of the notes that we either talked about earlier or something that I covered on my channel multiple different times. So obviously we've done the traffic stop study. I've done debates about the traffic stop study.
So in this daytime, nighttime thing, that's 100 million stops that were measured there?
Not during the day and the night, but after nightfall, it seems like cops pulled over less black people.
Not just as a friendly amendment, because I think this is what you mean, and the difference matters, right? What you're saying is, the absolute numbers aren't the point. What you're saying is that the racial disparity in stops narrowed after dark.
I'm unaware of the exact methodology of that study. I don't know if they looked at 50,000.
Do you know how the veil of darkness test is done or performed?
The veil of darkness, from my understanding, it's simply, it's just dark out. You can't really see their face. What are the specifications?
So the veil of darkness test, the way it's, by the way, the data set was originally like 255 million or so. They reduced it down because some of the data sets don't have like race, or there's some inconsistencies there. They reduced it down to about 95 million. When they applied the veil of darkness test, which is to say like, okay, we're trying to take similar periods of the day, but different, like the difference is, you know how like summertime versus wintertime, like it might be light out versus dark out, so they try to account for time of day by doing that. So you have summertime and I guess wintertime, and that's about 100,000 stops that they did. And the difference that they found there, as far as the difference between, I guess, blacks and whites being stopped, the difference between blacks being stopped in the daytime versus the nighttime. Do you know what the percentage difference was there?
If I remember correctly, it was like somewhere between 8 to 12. It's been a while since I read this.
It's like 8% or something like that.
Yeah,
so
it's fairly significant.
Well, hold on, but you're assuming like everything else is totally equal. The veil of darkness test doesn't make absolutely everything equal. So for example, in the daytime, there's a lot more things you can identify that you might not be able to identify in the nighttime, other than race, right? So like you might have a vehicle description that you can't see as well in the nighttime. Even the seasonality matters. For example, we know there's more violent crime and homicides that are committed during the summertime, but in the wintertime, like listen, black people don't like the cold.
And in my opinion, when we knew more about the traffic stop study than Ben Burgess and Xanderhal, they were none too pleased. They were not very comfortable having that conversation. And this was partially because we actually watched part of one of Ben Burgess's debates before, and he brings up the same talking points over and over again, including this traffic stop study. Not to mention, I've been confronted with this traffic stop study, and I've looked into the data, and I was able to disassemble their arguments in what I believe to be an effective manner, and just show more awareness of what they were talking about than what they were talking about. We talked about how they reduced the number of stops that they called 100 million from actually 255 million to 95 million, and how the veil of darkness, the thing meant to determine systemic bias, was a further reduction down to 115,000 stops, if I'm remembering correctly, because we had familiarized ourselves with the data more than they did. However, things got really funny when they started bringing up, and I think Xanderhal brought this up, the Ferguson DOJ report. Now, first and foremost, we know the Ferguson report was done in the shadow of the shooting of Michael Brown. I've covered how the forensic evidence showed beyond any doubt that the Michael Brown shooting was justified, that Brown was the aggressor, that Brown did reach for the gun, that Brown never put his hands up, and that Brown was charging Officer Darren Wilson after assaulting him, after reaching for his gun, at the time that he was ultimately shot and killed. So the investigation was done in part to find something wrong with the Ferguson Police Department, because this shooting was not going to be prosecutable in any sense of the law. And this led to a bunch of funny other exchanges where Ben Burgess was talking about unarmed black people being shot, and we were pointing out that Michael Brown would be counted as unarmed.
The case that the disparity in people being killed by cops based on race is actually wider, which it is by a lot, for unarmed people being killed by the cops.
But it's not.
That it doesn't.
But
killing police officers is not relevant if we're talking about unarmed people.
Well, no, hold on. First of all, that's not true, number one. Number two, if you're talking about the disparities of unarmed black people versus unarmed white people, of course the percentages are going to be outrageous because we're talking like 8 people a year. So obviously that's going to be true. Number two, unarmed means in a car driving at an officer because there's a legitimate purpose for you to have a car. Unarmed means Michael Brown actively trying to arm himself with Darren Wilson's gun when he stuck his hand and got so close, according to the Department of Justice report, to the gun that he was burned by the muzzle flash when Wilson fired upon him. Unarmed means charging at an officer for a gun. Those are all counted in those statistics. So the idea that you don't pose a threat because you're unarmed is ridiculous.
What do you think?
Even though at one point he got his hand so close to the gun, he was burned by the thermal indica when the fire shot came off, whatever I'm saying, you guys know what I mean. I put it in the thing, in the screen, so you can read it. That way you can understand what I mean, and I've covered this multiple different times. So he was in the act of arming himself, and unarmed includes people who are in the act of arming themselves. On top of that, it also includes people who are driving their car at the police because a vehicle is not considered a standard arm, so they would be unarmed in the vehicle. So the unarmed category doesn't mean a lot, as these people tend to state it. Unfortunately, neither one of them wanted to take the bait on the Michael Brown shooting at all, so we got things from the other Department of Justice report that was released same day as Michael Brown about how Ferguson's population is 67% black, yet 86% of the citations went to black people.
Talking about disparate treatment in Ferguson specifically, and Ferguson has a significantly older white population.
This accounted for that.
On top of that, no, it isn't. I've read the Department of Justice report. I didn't just cite factoids from it.
No,
they have a significantly older population. On top of that, Ferguson is not an island. They're an area that has one of the few grocery stores in the small town over there, so people are driving in and getting pulled over. So the idea that it's 67% black, yet 85% of the population of the people getting tickets are black, therefore racism.
It accounts for population.
Again,
no, you didn't listen to what he just said before.
Would be nice if they were an island in the middle of the sea, but people drive into Ferguson that don't live in Ferguson, especially since Ferguson has the grocery store that a lot of these little towns around it don't have.
Wait, why? Wait.
So
what difference does that make to what I said?
Driving in and getting pulled over.
Because you're accounting for the population of Ferguson and not the areas around that go into Ferguson.
Yes, but that does not change the fact that the police engage in what seems to be racial profiling.
I would not expect in a town of 67% black population where the median age is 20 years younger than the white population on its own to have any equivalency in any type of ticketing or anything like that. Let alone the fact that the people driving through Ferguson don't by law have to live in Ferguson. So the people who are coming into the area, the demographics of the area tell you nothing about that. You're talking about people being pulled over. So we got to talk about who's driving in. This is east of St. Louis. You think people ever drive the 16 miles from East St. Louis to Ferguson and then get pulled over? Maybe that adds into who's getting pulled over?
Of course it adds into who's going through there.
Now, of course, my retort to this is something I brought up on this channel before. It's something that I talked about in relation to Ferguson specifically because I know a lot about the city, because I've covered this story, the Michael Brown story, so many different times. It's actually ridiculous on this channel, is that the white population in Ferguson's median age, I believe, is 10 to 15, maybe even 20 years above the black population. So you would expect an older white population to offend significantly less than a younger black population. So 67% of a much younger population being responsible for 86% of the citations is nowhere near unusual in any way, shape, or form. Of course, Xanderhal wasn't familiar with the median age. I don't think he looked into my work related to Ferguson, and thus he was not prepared for it, and this led to funnier conclusions. However, Ben Burgess, with the Michael Bloomberg quote, was probably one of the most profoundly weird exchanges I've ever had on the topic of criminal justice. Actually, in reality, the whole thing about poverty being the natural state of man, as in when we became a species, when we came out of the earth, whatever you want to say is the origin of the human species. We didn't have a functioning economy. We had to use our reason to hunt, gather, and survive. We weren't wealthy at all. That was the weirdest part, but the second weirdest part was the fact that he tried to slip a Michael Bloomberg line by me, and these guys wanted to talk about stop and frisk. Really funny. Again, one of those moments where NuanceBro just looks over to me and smiles, and it's like, yeah, you got this. Like, it's something I've covered so many different times on my channel. It's basically second nature. I didn't even have to review any of the data. That's how familiar I am with it, because not only have I covered stop and frisk on my channel multiple different times, but I went to a criminal justice school 2014, 2015, 2016, and years earlier, where we covered stop and frisk because it was the hot news item at that time. So I'm very familiar with the data, and these guys were talking about how it's an example of over-policing or whatever, and I just asked them if stop and frisk is about shootings, and it is, by the way, it's clearly stated that it's about shootings, and the highest number of blacks and Hispanics ever stopped in a single year was 86% of the stops overall, and the lowest number of shootings was 94% for those same demographics. They represented no less than 94% of shooting suspects in the last 20 years in New York City. I will link all the data in the description. A lot of times I end up showing on screen the year to year, and a lot of you think that the image didn't even change that much. Then how can you say they were being over-targeted by this program? How can you say it was racially disproportionate when the program is meant to be aimed at that? If anything, it's racially disproportionate to white people. However, Ben Burgess tried to slip a Bloomberg quote by me that I was very familiar with, and he tried to say that it was prescriptive rather than descriptive. I'll let him say it, then I'll play the tape for you, and I'll let you determine who was right in this instance.
I did also just want to say on the question of whether stop and frisk disproportionately was applied to minorities, if it wasn't, that would have really disappointed the guy who oversaw that big expansion you were talking about, Michael Bloomberg, who in leaked audio, right, said 95% of your murders and murder victims fit one MO. You can just take the description, Xerox it, and pass it all out to the cops, Bloomberg said. They're male minorities, 16 to 25. That's true in New York. That's true in virtually every city. Some of the unintended consequence, people say, oh my God, you're arresting kids for marijuana. They're all minorities. Yes, that's true. Why? Because we put cops in minority neighborhoods, and he talks about...
you got to finish the quote. Why? Because that's where all the crime is. And
the way we get the guns out of the kid's hand is throw them up against the wall and frisk them. And it seems to me that in the quote, he's saying that he thinks that the description, the one you can Xerox and hand out to all the cops, is male minority 16 to 25. So the mayor, at least, on top of this system, thinks and expects and hopes that it's going to specifically target people for being male minority group members between 16 and 25. The data that Xander mentions seems to show that disproportionately this is who's stopped and frisked.
Wait, so disproportionately to what? The population or the amount that they're committing the crime?
Well, I mean, I think that maybe you can tell me specifically, what you were looking at. You were the one who referred to it, Xander. But I think that I would say, certainly I know on other issues, like shootings, I know that that there really isn't a correlation between like neighborhoods where there are police shootings and neighborhoods where there's been a higher rate of violent crime. There was a study I know, Minneapolis Star Tribune in 2018 looked at like 18 years of data and showed that there really wasn't one. There seems to be a lot of other evidence that a lot of other police practices can't really be reduced to that.
Now, I will say, I don't know a lot about Ben Burgis. I got to talk to him a little bit around the event, but not that much because I went out to dinner immediately following this debate, and I came back right before my next debate. He seems like a good guy. He seems like somebody who cares. He doesn't seem like somebody who's willfully spreading misinformation, and there's a lot of people that hear something, and remember, it gets processed in their brain, and they interpret it through their own lens. But if you listen to Michael Bloomberg's quote, and even if you listen to Ben Burgis saying Michael Bloomberg's quote, you realize that he's describing what New York City is dealing with. It's kind of a retort to people who are saying that he's targeting people based on race. He's explaining why. It even has that tone where he keeps saying why at the end of the sentence, and then he brings the next portion of it. And the last part of the quote, the reason I wanted him to finish the quote, is Bloomberg basically saying why, because that's where all the crime is. Meaning that they're targeting the crime, and it just so happens that you can basically Xerox the description for this particular type of crime, because the description of the perpetrator is so common for these type of crimes.
95% of your murderers and murder victims fit one MO. You can just take the description, Xerox it, and pass it out to all the cops. They are male, minorities, 15 to 25. That's true in New York, it's true in virtually every city. And that's where the real crime is. You've got to get the guns out of the hands of the people that get killed. So you want to spend the money, put a lot of cops in the street, put those cops where the crime is, which means in minority neighborhoods. So it's one of the unintended consequences is people say, oh my God, you are arresting kids for marijuana that are all minorities. Yes, that's true. Why? Because we put all the cops in the minority neighborhoods. Yes, that's true. Why do we do it? Because that's where all the crime is. And the way you get the guns out of the kids' hands is to throw them against the wall and frisk them. And then they say, oh, I don't want to get caught, so they don't bring the gun. They still have a gun, but they leave it at home.
Now, it would be one thing if what Bloomberg was saying was not accurate, if he wasn't describing reality, if he was way off base, if he was way overestimating. But he said during the course of that about 95%. And I talked to you about shooting suspects in the city of New York, and in no year of the last 20 years is there less than 94% of the shooting suspects being Hispanic or Black in the city of New York. It's just not there. So if you want to say that Bloomberg was way overboard by being off by 1%, even though in many years it goes up to around 97%, then you can do that. But nobody would hold anybody on their side that they didn't already dislike to that standard. And Ben Burgis did not seem to be aware of the fact that Bloomberg's quote was dead accurate. And again, if you listen to it, if you hear him out, as somebody like me who doesn't like Bloomberg, who thinks that he overdid stop and frisk to a certain extent, to the point where he created bad community relations between the police and the communities most affected by crime, I still say I can't take him out of context. I can't lie about him. I can't misinterpret what he said. I have to give him the best faith opportunity. One of the reasons why I'm giving him this is because I don't like Bloomberg so much for a multitude of other reasons that I've looked into many of the scandals surrounding him and found out that some of these are just nonsensical. Bloomberg told the truth here. Where Bloomberg messed up is where he apologized for his policing tactics, where he said, oh, don't worry, I'm woke, don't just vote for me for president, and he cowered, even though in terms of crime, he was pretty on point in making sure that it was reduced. Mistakes made, obviously, those exist, But overall, he had the right attitude that you need to be tough on crime in order to have success, and he continued what was laid out before him by Mayor Giuliani. Now, overall, I think the debate went as well as any of these could go. There was somebody who came up to me after it and said that he started out on the side of Xanderhal and Ben Burgis, but slowly but surely me and NuanceBro convinced him to come over to our side. So whatever that one anecdotal example, hi Mark, by the way, is actually worth is up to you guys. I don't really know. I can't really extrapolate based on that. I don't think anybody particularly embarrassed themselves.
Some suggestions there, by the way. First one, complete federal legalization of marijuana. First one would absolutely help everybody. I've gone on this rant a million times, and I'll go on it again. Everybody is hurt by marijuana not being federally legalized, okay? Every one of you is harmed by this, okay? Especially the black community. We all know the black community has been policed for possession of marijuana for a very long time. It's true. Even though black people don't use marijuana at a higher rate than white people do, I assure you, I smoke more weed than anybody, okay? I love it. Yeah, and I think federally legalizing that would be a big deal. Right now, if you are an aspiring black dispensary owner, even in like California or Colorado, places where it's legal, you can't get a loan from a bank until marijuana is federally legalized. So you have to already have the capital to put down the investment to start that dispensary because you can't go to a bank. Very simple things like that that literally help everybody.
I got it. Make black people drug dealers again, and make prisons nicer. Got it.
And I haven't rewatched the video, but I had a feeling that there was some level of incoherence, and that was partially due to the fact that Xanderhal and Ben Burgis are completely different people. So what would end up happening is Xander would make a point, or Burgess would make a point, then the other one would speak, and they would bring up something else. And then when it came over to NuanceBro or myself, we would have to choose what or who we would want to respond to. And sometimes there were points where NuanceBro would kick it over to me, but he wanted to respond to something later, and then they'd retort. And by the time he responded, he was talking about something that felt like completely different, even though we're all trying to address the same thing. It wasn't too bad. Everybody was pretty cordial. Xanderhal got a little bit long-winded at certain points, but, that's part of his thing. And I really did appreciate how NuanceBro called him out on that whole why thing where, the lefties ask you why over and over again. And he was like, listen, I'm not here to explain anything to you. Why don't you bring your own ideas to the table and you tell me what you think it is?
I guess the question this would be then why? I mean, we have to talk about why, right? Isn't this a problem?
Yeah, crime is a problem.
Why do black and Hispanic males aged 16 to 24 commit these disproportionate crimes?
Why does it seem like the black community in America generally seems to commit more crime?
Why does it seem like cross-culturally they commit more crime?
Why do you think they commit? I'm just asking you a
I'm
question.
asking you, why cross-culturally in other nations? You don't know?
I mean, I don't
Well, then
know
why
what
even
they're
ask
thinking.
this question? Why are we?
Why
are we even asking this question?
Why do you think that the black community is starting to, I guess, forego more nuclear families? Why do you think it's starting to
How
become
come
more
you never give any explanations?
I'm asking a question. I'm curious.
Do you have an explanation?
If I were to guess, it would probably have something to do with the combination of culture and policing.
Which I actually really appreciated. I think it was a strong rebuttal because these lefties like to position themselves. And it's not just a lefty thing. It's actually a smart debate tactic thing where you position yourself as the interrogator, the one asking the questions, because that puts you in the dominant position. Because if the other person is always debating on your terms, it looks like you have control over the situation. NuanceBro was not having it, and I appreciate that from him. And overall, it is what it is. I mean, there were other debates that I was in. I had a really nice conversation, which turned out to not be a debate, that I'll link to in the description. You guys could check that out. And the overall Destiny thing was also not a debate, but kind of fun. And it was funny because we were trying to push it, or at least I was trying to make it a debate, and I know James was trying to make it a debate by bringing up topics and things that people thought we would argue over, but for whatever reason, Destiny wasn't in the mood to argue, so we ended up having an interesting conversation, and things were all good. Also, at one point, I confused Norway with Sweden. I said something about the cultural practices of Norway, and Destiny knew I was talking about Norway. He told me after we got off stage, he's like, oh, by the way, I knew you were talking about Norway. I just didn't want to tell you because I don't help people when I'm debating them. And I'm like, that's actually pretty funny. So yeah, those were the events. I don't know if you guys watched any of the debates. If you did, you have any thoughts or whatever, criticisms, all that, leave it in the comments of the video. I will link all 3 debates on the Modern Day Debates channel. You could watch all of them. You could review them. You could do your thing, a little dance, whatever. but let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. As usual, if you liked the video, you show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, support me via the support links in the description box. This has been me talking about the thing, whatever, till next time.